What would it look like to create a subplot for your life? And how could it enrich your main story? If you're a driven individual, I'm willing to bet you struggle with making space for subplots, pursuits unrelated to your work. Some people call them hobbies, though maybe that's not the right way to refer to them. But today's guest is going to share with us about his subplot and how it's transforming him into a better storyteller. So stick around to find out why you need a subplot for your life on this episode of Everything is Storytelling. You've heard it said that storytelling is everything. But what if everything is storytelling? What if every action we take, every word we speak, every thought we think is a story? If so, then we all need to be better storytellers, because the story we tell will determine the impact we make in our lives, in our work, and in our dreams. I'm Jonathan Jordan, your storytelling coach, and this is Everything is Storytelling, a podcast for people obsessed with story. Our guest today is Charlie Daly, a ghostwriter and book editor who helps authors and brands put their legacy on the page. His work has helped authors achieve bestseller status and score interviews and visibility. He also has his own podcast, Notes from a Ghost. And if that's not all enough, he's also working to become the first person to kayak all the way around Ireland. Did I say that correctly?
Not the first, but only about...
Oh, not the first.
It's going to be my second attempt, and only about 30 people have done it solo.
That's still not many people.
No, it's the kind of snarky answer is it is not the Everest of sea kayaking, because thousands and thousands of people have climbed Mount Everest, and only about 100 have been around Ireland.
Yeah, that's ridiculous to me either way. So to help kind of tee up our conversation, what I wanted to really talk about today was what it looks like to have a subplot for your life. You know, we usually think of subplots as something for literature, right? That kind of helps hold up the main story, even though it's not the main story, but we need to define that. So I was thinking about how a lot of driven individuals, they tend to experience a pressure to connect everything they do to their main story, whether that's their business or their brand, especially if they're obsessed with storytelling. Like everything has to be about that one thing. So if there's an activity or, quote unquote hobby in their life that doesn't have a clear ROI attached to it, they kind of tend to put it on the sidelines. And I know I've experienced that because, for example, if I'm deciding what book I'm going to read next, I always feel like I have to justify it in terms of my work. Like, well, this book is going to make me a better business person, or that one's going to make me a better writer. So I have a tendency to view something I love, reading, as market research instead of enjoying it for its own merits. So that's how I'm defining a subplot for your life, since that is, again, kind of what they do in literature. You could cut them out, so to speak. The main story is unchanged, but they should enrich the main story. So let's dive in, or kayak in, whatever we want to say. And yeah, Charlie, tell me more about your subplot, your kayaking adventures. What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, first of all, Jonathan, thanks for having me. This is my favorite thing to talk about. And especially where it intersects with writing. Such an interesting frame to put around this, and a way to look at it. Because if you think about it too, the subplot is also where the real emotional payoffs of the story usually are. If anybody's seen like The Fighter, you don't actually really care if he wins the title. You want to see if he can repair his broken family, and if his brother can heal, and if you look at any story that has a really strong subplot like that, that's usually what you're there for, and it's usually what takes up the actual there's kind of that false ending about 20 minutes before the end of the movie, but then the subplot has to be resolved, and that's the part that makes you cry.
Yeah.
And the sea is that for me, and it really always has been.
Mm,
I grew up on both sides of the Atlantic in Ireland and on Cape Cod,
mm,
um, and just surrounded by um, people who were spending their free time in boats, in some cases
mhm,
working on boats, and and then further back, there's all sorts of lore of, my dad's a Marine. He was carried to cross the Pacific on a troop ship. He came to America on a ship from Ireland as a young boy. Um, my mother's family would have come on sailing ships a few generations before that, and yeah, so there connection with this, and then just for me personally, all my recreational activities have always been in the ocean, and
yeah.
it was a place that where everything kind of makes sense and things kind of quiet down, and I don't have to really think about what's going on in my day job or personal life or whatever. And that's I've been so lucky to have that and to grow up with that. And when I was a teenager, I related to the sea in a very teenager way, whereas like, screw you guys, I'm going surfing. And it was like kind of, it had that edge to it. And then as I'm getting a little older, it's like, it's kind of, there's a spiritual dimension to it that wasn't there when I was a
Mm,
kid.
yeah.
But it is, yeah, it's that is the subplot, and it's the I don't know where there'd be no story without the presence of the sea in my life, I think.
I think that's so interesting you say that it's a place of like calm and like serenity for you, because most people don't think of the sea that way, right? We think of it as tumultuous, as chaos. I literally just a couple nights ago was listening to a speaker who said the ocean is his greatest fear. He will not get into the ocean, even at a beach. Like he will just stay on the land because he's so terrified of what's lurking underneath the water. So I love that you have the totally different mindset around the sea.
Yeah, and something that's probably worth pointing out is it's not a and I'm a very proud volunteer crew. I live in Ireland where the Coast Guard is mostly volunteers, and
Mm,
on a lifeboat crew. I'm wearing a pager. If it goes off during this interview, I gotta go.
that's fine.
And it probably won't. We're not a very busy station, but I'm involved in search and rescue,
Yeah,
and I say that to say this isn't a naive like, oh, the sea is so pretty. I'm
right.
the very aware of how dangerous it is out there, and I think oftentimes people who just have, first of all, you should have like an instinctive fear of the ocean. If you
Yeah,
don't, you don't understand it. Um, but also as you gain experience out there, you actually learn. Like that guy he probably doesn't even know what he has to be afraid of out there.
right.
And you think of like Quint in Jaws is
Mm,
the classic
yeah,
salty old guy with a healthy respect. Because yeah, you're learning how to, and what I really love about something like sea kayaking is you are learning how to engage with the sea on the sea's terms, and
yeah.
how to be smart and make good decisions so you can be out there safely and travel long distances with just your own hand power. And I do most of my navigating with paper charts and a compass. And
Oh, wow.
it's yeah, it's but you're right. It's a scary place. It's a violent place, and it's a good place to be if you're someone who is soothed by a chaotic environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I have two children, so I know what it's like to live in a chaotic environment. So I do want to hear more about kind of the preparation stuff of like what goes into making these adventures happen. Before we get into that though, I want to hear you talk a little bit more about what does kayaking do for you that writing doesn't? Because obviously you love writing, you do it as a profession. So how do you feel kayaking adds to your story in a way that just sitting down with pen or paper, or rather computer and keyboard can't do?
I think a lot of it has to do with motion.
Okay.
You're constantly moving, and you go into this meditative state where you're just, or flow state where you're
Mm,
just you and the paddle, and you're connected with the sea. you have these your thoughts get sort of weird, and especially if you're solo, you can get, people call them like brain worms or mind worms, where you'll say get a song stuck in your head for like 10 hours or something like
Yeah.
that. um, and but that's, I think, all related to motion and solitude. And where they're similar is the solitude, that to really do it, it's just kind of you and the page, you and the water.
Mm,
But on the other hand, writing it can feel a little bit confined. um I was a late blooming reader. I really have a hard time, like I have ADHD. I have a really hard time sitting still. um so while writing can be, I think, an emotional outlet and a intellectual outlet, it doesn't provide motion, and you can go places on the page metaphorically, but you don't
right.
actually travel or see things. Or so I think that's where, there's a difference, and where they complement each other.
Yeah.
Because I think in a long trip there's a narrative element to that.
Tell me too just a little bit about more for how this connects to your heritage in particular, because you already touched on that a little bit, growing up on both sides of the Atlantic. And you had a really great post I saw recently on your Substack about reaching the Lonely Rock and how that was a milestone. So can you talk a little bit more about that experience and how it connects you to a story bigger than yours?
Sure, yeah. And this place, it's and I don't know how to pronounce the Irish name, but it's Fastnet Rock, and there's a lighthouse perched on it that's been there for over 100 years. And it's legend, no through legend and whatnot, it's called Ireland's teardrop. And it's
Mm,
because of where it's located. It's a few miles offshore, so it's a couple hours of paddling each way, and you're out in the middle of the ocean. There's nowhere to go. You can't necessarily land on the rock if it's too rough. And it was my first time getting out there. It's very near where I live, but the conditions have to be just perfect for you to get out there. And
mm,
it was a really pivotal, kind of emotional high point in my career as a kayaker. But also, it's a place that, they called it Ireland's teardrop because it would be the last piece of Irish land that people emigrating to new lives in America and elsewhere um,
mm.
would have seen. And I mean, Ireland, if you know the history at all, I mean, most of the population left due to starvation and colonization.
Yeah.
Um, and this place, as it would have faded into the wake of their ship, and that would have, they,
Mm,
for most of them, that would never have seen Ireland again. It was the last land that passengers on the Titanic would have seen.
mm.
And because for
Wow.
navigation purposes, it's the equivalent of like a major exit on a highway, or it's where ships essentially turn to get around Ireland and out into the Atlantic. And in my family, my mother's family would have been among those people who left in the late 1800s. And
Okay.
for my father's family who stayed, his father and one other guy are the only men who ever came back from the First World War.
Mm,
And that they would have passed the fastnet on their troop ships going to war. And so yeah, I mean, there's something. It is one of those places where you really feel your connection to this place and the waters around it. And Ireland being an island, you can't separate history from the sea. And yeah, it was very special to be out there. I shed a few Irish tears on myself,
yeah.
and it's cool too to have something like that in your backyard, and to see it and know that you've been out there. It's not going to look the same again.
Yeah. What a cool like reminder that that you're the continuation of a bigger story, right? And there's a legacy there. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about kind of the preparation and what goes into actually getting into the kayak. Because I think it's easy for those of us who don't do it to just be like, oh, you've got your boat and your paddle and there you go, right? But you're out there for huge amounts of time. So what kind of things are you having to think about and prepare for whenever you're going out?
Yeah, so it's probably useful to talk about the differences between this sea kayaking at this level on
Mm-hmm.
expeditions versus just because I think most people have been in a kayak, but usually it's these
Yeah.
sort of large bathtub plastic boats to go,
Right.
which is great. I mean, that's how I started kayaking. I'm not criticizing that, but the boat that I paddle, it's made of fiberglass. It's very fast. It's about 17 feet long,
Mm.
16 and some change, something like that, and most of it is storage. There's all sorts of, it's designed to go very fast, to carry a lot of gear, like my body weight again in food, and which is great because if you think of backpacking, you can carry a 50 liter pack with maybe 40 pounds of stuff in it, and you're kind of limited, whereas everything I need for a month fits in the kayak, and then I can resupply. And I land every night on these trips, and some, everything from an overnight to going around Ireland. I'm hoping to do it in less than 40 days, but really the weather decides how long it takes. And then you bring a tent and all the stuff you'd need. And Ireland, the coastline, most of it is pretty remote. You're not really competing for space to pitch your tent. But so a couple other big differences in this kind of style of kayaking. You tend to take very direct routes. We'd say like headland to headland. If you look at a map of Ireland, you're not going into every little bay. That would take you,
Right.
I mean, that's like thousands of miles. It would take you over a year. What you do is you skip across them. You cut these corners, but that puts you like out at sea for hours. And you need the right conditions. You need to really know what you're doing, and you really need to understand how your navigation and your planning and all of that interacts with the weather and just common sense, I guess. And there's a fitness aspect, but the main thing is there's like a mental toughness. You got to get used to putting on wet clothes every morning, and that's hard. But
sounds awful.
yeah. It's a really and there's a term, and I've talked about on my podcast, is type 2 fun, and things that are not actually fun. Like, so you like Disney, like going to Disney, with the exception maybe of the waiting in line part, is probably like type 1 fun. Like, it's fun to do it and it's fun to look back on it. It's basically just, it's all fun. Whereas, a day where all your gear gets wet and you like have to build a fire and whatever, like that's probably a really fun story to tell later, but it wasn't actually fun when it was happening. And then the other thing about Ireland that is unique and really commands respect, and the reason very few people have done this trip besides the weather, is that most of the coast are these sea cliffs. That's what people come to Ireland to take pictures of and to see hiking. But for most people, if you grew up on land, your instinct is you'd want to be on land. But eventually, you want to, depending on the conditions, you don't want to be anywhere near land. Like, you're safer, it's calmer, farther out. Because the place where the waves hit the cliff and then bounce back, like the waves in Fantasia that go like up and down.
Oh yeah.
That happens, and they can be like the size of houses, and you don't want to be in that. So you have to understand that your nearest landing could be like 6 hours away. And so then all your planning is like, okay, no matter what happens, I am on the water. I'm committed. And if I'm headed to an island offshore, like there's a point halfway where you're just going to have to keep going no matter what happens, or you're going to have to turn around and find some alternative. I don't think I'm selling this as a fun activity.
I don't think that was the point ever. But yeah, I mean, point taken. Like, there's not an exit ramp. So ton of preparation, ton of planning has to go into this, which of course I think does have a good overlap with writing, because I mean, how many times have both of us as ghostwriters, I'm sure you've had that situation where someone's like, well, I've been trying to write this book on my own, and I've got 50 pages, but they don't even have an outline, like, I'm sure you've run into that. I've run into that. And of course it's like, yeah, there was no planning involved. So you got to kind of backtrack and say, like, let's make a plan first. Right. So I'm curious to kind of then segue into, like, how do you feel like, do you feel like kayaking has made you a better storyteller, or like we talked about in the intro, is it just completely unrelated? Does it just stand alone on its own merits and doesn't need to overlap with storytelling in terms of your work? How do you view it?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked your description in the intro, how we end up connecting these things
Yeah,
anyway, or wanting them to connect. And
right.
that's definitely been the case for me. There's a writing project that I have, a Substack that I do that's associated with it's just kayaking, and it's about my
Yeah.
preparation for my second attempt. It's lessons learned from my first attempt, and just all the fun little trips I do and side quests. And it's both. The kayaking kind of is a writing project at this point. The one thing I talk about with ghostwriting clients a lot is there's a difference between a story, and you and I talked about this when you were on
Yeah.
my podcast, but like there's a difference between a story and just like a funny thing that happened to you, or
Mm,
like an impressive fact. And I think a lot of times people who have a very exciting, interesting life, they don't always understand that nobody, like, I don't want to say nobody cares, but like with the subplot in a movie, it's not about like there's a thing in screenwriting I heard where it's like you're not watching the movie to see the winning touchdown. You're watching the movie to see the football player like hug his kids and kiss his wife after he scores
right.
the touchdown. It's the emotional payoff. And I think some people like taking a trip, and there's a brilliant adventure writer, Harley Rustad, who's coming on my podcast. The episode will probably be up by the time this one goes up, so I can talk about it. But he said, a trip is just a line on a map, and
Mm,
if you don't find the story in it and the meaning and the subplot, I guess to use this analogy, nobody cares. There's nothing there. It's just and it's I think when I do a trip report, so like my last attempt around Ireland ended in an injury and surgery.
mm,
And first, I felt like a total failure. I felt like I'd let my sponsors down, and all the rest. And I had promised them exposure and coverage and all these things, and I my trip was a failure. And on top of that, I kept going with a serious injury, and I thought people were going to criticize that, and I would have
mm,
criticized someone doing that. I think it was unsafe,
right.
um, but that ended up being what I wrote about. I wrote about what is it like to have this trip and make it your whole life, and make sacrifices to do the training you need to do, and then have it not work out and go really badly sideways. And then what do you take away from that? And
Mm,
what is it like to learn the hard way that it really isn't the destination? And
yeah.
and so yeah, I mean those things are deeply connected, and I think again, I mean I probably sound really like I'm romanticizing. It's a very Irish American thing to do when I talk about my family and their
Yeah.
story. But I got into all this. My dad introduced me to the ocean, and for him it was something. He's a partially disabled veteran, and this was
Mm,
a place where he wasn't disabled anymore. And it's like we're going to see in the Paralympics
yeah.
coming up, is like
Yeah.
that's one of the beautiful things about water is the lessons it teaches you, and then the qualities it brings out of you that maybe aren't there on dry land.
Yeah. Yeah. By the time this episode comes out, the Paralympics will be over, but I appreciate the shout out to them because I do love the
Yeah, I know you're
Paralympics.
you're an Olympic guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
shout out to Ireland. Right now we're
I know. Yeah.
third per capita in the world, for such a small island and a small team,
Yeah.
or actually big team, small population.
Right. Yeah. No, they've had a good games. So I made a little list last night while I was preparing for this conversation. This wasn't originally, I think, what I was planning on talking about, but my curiosity got the best of me. And so I started thinking about, okay, who are some other prominent people who have had subplots in their life that I can point to and say, hey, this works. This is something that is important to do, that you need to have a passion outside of your main thing. So So there were a few that I found that I wanted to kind of read off before we get into our last question here. So
Yeah.
some of the people I found, a variety of people across different industries. So I found out that Bob Dylan likes welding iron sculptures.
No way.
So yes, so not exactly related to writing music, of course, but I thought
No.
that was so cool. Meryl Streep, of course, great actress, one of the best ever, likes knitting, and that was actually something for those who watch Only Murders in the Building. She's in the latest season, and they actually have her character do a little bit of knitting in one of the episodes I remember. So I thought that was kind of fun. I was like, oh, so she actually knows how to do that. That wasn't just, Meryl Streep is such a great actress. You could tell her to do anything and she'd look like she's done it for 100 years. So I thought that was fun. Another actor, Tom Cruise, found out that he is really into fencing. And apparently he regularly spars with Will Smith and David Beckham.
And there's
Yeah.
I don't know the guy's name. The guy from Iron Maiden, one of the guys from Iron Maiden is a fencer,
Oh,
apparently.
really?
Like at a
Okay.
high level. And then they have a pilot too in that band. Like he flies there like a commercial jet that the band flies around in.
That's crazy. I had never heard that. And then a couple other people that I looked up that I thought was fun. Mark Zuckerberg. I had no idea. He's really into hunting, and he will not eat any meat that he doesn't hunt himself. Like it's a sustainability thing for him. And I'm
Sure.
like, you look at the guy and you don't think like he's going out into the woods to, take down a deer or whatever, but apparently he does. Everyone knows that Winston Churchill liked writing and painting, but what I didn't know about him is one of his other passions was bricklaying.
Yes. Yeah. And apparently I was reading something that I think like as far as like if you had to put your income on your taxes, like I think
Yeah.
he was mainly a writer. Like
Yeah.
he almost you could almost say that like his being a politician was like his side hustle because he made
Right.
most of his income. I mean, obviously some family money there, but writing and
Yeah.
journalism, and
Yeah.
he had won a Nobel Prize for literature too. There's a remarkable book, and I don't know if you've encountered it, but it's called
Uh-huh.
Range, and it's kind of because
Hmm.
I think a weird side effect of like startup culture and tech entrepreneurship is this idea of like just the grind and having these single focus specialists. Even among writers, it's like you're supposed to have a niche. And this book
Right.
talks about how even in fields that you would assume require like hyper specialization, like oncology, the person who is like going to cure cancer probably found some weird analogy between like whatever kind of sport they do on the weekends and
Right.
the science of it. And I mean, even if you look at how people have made really important breakthroughs, a lot of times they were informed by really just random special interests because they were a well-rounded. And I think in other days that was more common. I mean, once upon a time
Yeah.
you weren't really even educated unless you spoke French, Latin, and Greek. And then it
Yeah.
became just French. And
Yeah, I mean it's the classical education model. You need to
sure,
know a little bit about everything. Of course, that's where liberal arts is supposed to come from. But Western culture has very much moved in the past 50 years to this idea of you got to be a specialist, right? You
yes,
got to
yep,
specialize. And yeah, it's easy for people to kind of beat themselves up when they don't have that specialist thing. But there's a lot of beauty in also being the generalist and knowing a little bit about a lot. But yeah, Churchill with the bricklaying, I thought it was weird at first when I read that, but then I started to think about like there must have been something therapeutic about like you're just doing kind of the same motions over and over again, and then also like there's a tangible result from what
yes,
you're doing. Like you can actually see the progress of I started with nothing and then I built something. And that must have, especially being a politician, where a lot of times I'm sure things always feel like they're running into a brick wall, to actually build a brick wall and be like, I did this and I made this thing. Yeah, must have been an incredibly rewarding activity outside of his other work. So, well, you perfectly segued into this idea of like advice that you would give for storytellers. You've given us a book recommendation. We'll put that into the into the show notes because I think that sounds like a great book I need to add to my own list. But to kind of cap things off here, any kind of final advice you would give to other storytellers out there who maybe they're lacking that subplot in their life? What would you tell them to do? Like, what would you tell them? Why do they need to find that subplot?
I think there's a lot of things that are more interesting than writing, and weirdly enough, writing it's not violin. It doesn't give back sort of linear progress for linear input. I think certain musical disciplines you do need to put in just crazy hours
Yeah.
if you want to improve. Writing really isn't like that, in my opinion. Assuming you have just kind of a baseline of talent, you're probably better off focusing on things other than writing so that you have something to write about. I don't know. Just, I mean, looking at, and I mean, specifically if we're talking about storytellers and writers, I mean, looking at kind of everything you do as potential material or inspiration, if you want to use that word.
Yeah.
And seeing where your interests lie. I mean, one of the things I'm really grateful for with spending so much time on the water and messing around with boats is it's allowed me to hold on to this. I wanted to be a pirate when I was like 5 years old, and I still do. And it lets me have adventures and be an explorer and specifically with kayaks, when you take things down to the level of like you're about a couple feet over the surface of the water and you're moving not very fast, it becomes possible to be an explorer in the 21st century and see things in just a new way and see things that not a lot of people have seen. Almost everyone who goes to Ireland goes to the Cliffs of Moher to get that sort of picture that everybody in the same spot. Not a lot of people have kayaked under the Cliffs of Moher and seen them from the water.
Yeah.
Getting in the habit of following your curiosity and seeing where it leads and is a good practice for a writer anyway.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And again, like I'm not saying spend a bunch of money on gear or go take trips to far-flung places. There's a travel writer I really like who has made a career going to places that people think they kind of can't go to, so-called dangerous, so-called off-limits kind of destinations. But he was saying, if you want to have an adventure, like go to a bar in a part of town that you normally wouldn't visit.
Yeah.
And just strike up a conversation. I think one of the real tragedies of the way people live in a lot of places in this day and age, besides the fact that that's just like you've got your job and your home, and the people have talked about the lack of a third place to go, and but also living in these weird sort of self-isolating bubbles where you're kind of only around people like you, and you maybe even are would be afraid to go and meet someone who had just a totally different life and whatever. And I think that some really interesting things can happen when you engage in that kind of, I don't even want to use the word travel, but when you branch out and see what's out there. And I don't know. Talk to strangers. I guess that's my advice.
Yeah. It's about broadening your perspective. And sometimes that's going to happen out on your own, just doing something unrelated where, again, you get a different perspective of the cliffs that most people don't see. You also get that different perspective from being around a community, around an idea, right? And I think for me, having that subplot is about not being one dimensional, right? So to think about the analogy of writing, if you've ever read a book where you're like, yeah, I don't know, the writing was okay, but it just landed flat. It probably just didn't have enough dimension to it, right? It didn't have those subplots that kind of lifted it up. And so I think it's the same for us as human beings. Like, we're meant to be multidimensional. And so finding those subplots for our own life, whether we're a writer or a manufacturer or an athlete or whatever it is we do, we need that multidimensionality to have a fully, rich life, right?
And if I'm thinking too very specifically about the type of book that you and I might be writing as ghostwriters, let's say a business book or a startup founder story.
Yeah.
I think the multidimensional perspective you're talking about is the antidote to the book that could have been a blog post.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, because you do get those different details in it, right? That otherwise would have been missing if it was only focused on this one area. You get those stories that accentuate it, right, and add those layers to it that otherwise, yeah, this could have been a blog post without it. No, it's a great way to look at it. Well, man, Charlie, I always love talking with you. This is great. Tell everybody real quick, where can they follow you, especially your kayaking adventures? How can they connect with you? Of course, we'll make sure it's in the show notes too, but for people who don't check the show notes, this is your chance to tell them how to track you down.
Sure. So the kayaking stuff is all on the lap, and I think it's the lap, lap.substack.com.
Okay.
I think anyway, it's on Substack, and there is a fundraising component to that too. This trip is ultimately, I'm going to try to raise some money for the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's research.
Yeah.
Something very close to my heart. And the writing is at dailyprose.com, DALY prose, like poetry and prose.
Yeah.
And I'm on LinkedIn, and most of my handles are at Daily Prose, Instagram.
Okay.
And yeah, that's me. And I'm open to ghostwriting work. If you have a great story or you know someone who does, I do business books, but I also do memoirs. And my real specialty is working with people who have difficult stories to tell, whether that's trauma or I've worked with a lot of military books and first responders.
Yeah.
Again, I guess there's the intensity. If there's an intensity to your story, I want to hear it.
Yeah. Well, and if you have an intensity to that story, you need that empathetic ear to like help you bring that story to life. Like that's why so many books don't get written. It's such an emotionally taxing process that's why people need a ghostwriter or a book coach, like someone who's with them through that process. Again, being their community, right? This was so much fun. I love keeping up with what you're doing, kayaking around Ireland. It's nothing I would ever do myself. So,
well, if you're ever over here, we'll go for like a chill day paddle. And
yeah, I would do a chill day paddle. Absolutely, 100%. But yeah, I need to probably still be able to see the shore. So
no, 100%. We'll stay in view of land, and I even have the paddle in mind. There's a place where we can go see some seals and dolphins, and then if you're a Guinness guy, there's a pub where we can stop and take a little Guinness break, and then.
I mean, have you been to Ireland if you haven't stopped to get a Guinness in a pub? Probably not.
The funny thing, I don't drink. And it's because that's obviously the other major way that people connect with Irish culture.
Right.
And,
right.
And it's always kind of funny. Yeah, they have great seltzer water over here.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, for all of our friends out there who abstain, absolutely, they've got an option too. Charlie, thanks again for coming on the show. Now I feel like I need to go kayak. If you want to follow along with Charlie's kayaking adventures, go subscribe to his newsletter, The Lap, on Substack. And if you want to learn more about his work as a writer, make sure to check out his podcast about storytelling, Notes from a Ghost. Or check out his website, dailyprose.com. That's DALY, the word prose.com. But I'll have links to all those in the show notes. And if you haven't done it already, make sure you are subscribed to Everything is Storytelling so you don't miss an episode. And if today's episode helped you at all, it would be incredible if you took 2 minutes to leave a rating and a review. It's such an easy way to help other story-obsessed people join the conversation. And until next time, let's keep changing the world together, one story at a time.